Video disclaimer. This video uses an AI voiceover. Everything else is made by a real human. As a part 2 to my video about Jasper, I thought I could tackle the slightly less popular but still relevant video by Forrest Valkai that aims to defend the gender ideology. Forrest is a PhD student, so an actual academic, unlike Jasper. And the video was supposedly reviewed by several professionals, so this looks to be the strongest case for the gender ideology that I could find on YouTube or any other platforms. Let's see how his findings hold up. Before I begin, I just want to point out what bothered me the most about his video, which is that his reference list is terribly put together. He does not note which reference corresponds to which point in his video, thus putting all references in alphabetical order is a choice that makes his claims very difficult to track and verify. I'm also fairly sure some of those references don't even address any of the points in his video, which is also why it would have been important to mark what belongs where either in the video or segment the reference list accordingly. It's almost like he threw in a ton of random articles in no order and called it a day. If you want to educate people, at least make it easy to fact-check your claims next time, Forrest. It's wild that none of the reviewers pointed this out to you. Don't you also cite your papers in text when you write articles? Creating this reference puzzle game was not a very professional way of handling your sources. That said, I will look at this video in the same parts Forrest divided his video into. Let's begin. In the first few minutes, Forrest explains some basic biological facts, which I don't have any problem with. All he says is true and is pretty basic biology. He then talks about the many different ways sex is expressed across the animal, plant, fungi, and bacterial kingdoms, which is also all accurate. However, here we bump into our first and possibly main issue. Why is this relevant to humans? The science is really interesting and cool, and I don't see any wrong information looking at his sources for this. But why bring any of this up? We are humans. We can't change our gender on command. We don't have special cells that change sex based on the situation. We aren't bacteria or fungi, and we can't just decide to be a different sex. And that's not to say that humans would be above the animal kingdom, but birds also aren't lizards. Fish aren't bacteria. All those interesting examples Forrest gives are fascinating, but they are characteristic of a species. They are the default for all organisms of a said species, not an anomaly. Humans simply don't have those features. We have binary sex and mutations. If a lizard can decide to change sex, it physically can perform appropriate functions without medical intervention. Humans can't do that. If someone thinks they are the opposite gender, they don't actually change their biological functions. I fail to see the connection how this applies to humans. Two sexes exist in humans. We aren't talking about other species. 4 sexes in a random fungus doesn't mean humans have 4 sexes too. In part 2, Forrest first attempts to show that sex characteristics can overlap, and this is true, but only for certain features. Sex-determining characteristics do not overlap like that. 2/3 of people do not have a random mix of sexual organs, they have either one or the other. Also, averages matter, they are statistically significant. Furthermore, your nice graph on the supposed spectrum of sex characteristics shows a good point. Internal and external sex characteristics are the vast majority of the population, while everything in the middle is literally a rare mutation. The center part is intersex, which is incredibly rare, and I showed in my last video that they still exhibit normal sex characteristics. External male with anatomical variations, it even says in the picture that it's rare. All these things are very rare. They aren't a spectrum or a choice. They are mutations. They don't mean the average person can decide what they are. De la Chapelle syndrome is 1 in 25,000 people. Swyer syndrome is 1 in 100,000 people. All the mutations combined so far don't reach even 0.1% of the population. Forrest, do not use exceptions as the rule. If you want to present a rule, show something that the majority of the population has or can do. Also, you even say that women with Swyer syndrome still perform female biological functions, so they are women with a mutation, not a new gender.
These aren't anomalies or crazy mutations. These are persistent evolutionary changes.
Yes, they are. This is the definition of an anomaly. Turner syndrome is the most common, and it still affects one in several thousands of women. And yet, those are still women. Same goes for all the other examples Forrest names. All of those are rare things, and they don't define new sexes. They maybe affect what is expressed, sure, but it doesn't make sex fluid in any kind of sense that the gender ideology claims. It doesn't mean you can identify as whatever you want. It doesn't mean that you can change anything once you're born. In the response video to Jasper, I showed this intersex person, and we can see that the other biological features clearly show that he is a male with a chromosomal mutation. Maybe this person has a weird assortment of chromosomes, or gonadal sex, or whatever. But the facial hair, body hair, stature, face, balding head all indicate that this is clearly a man. These people are still binary. If you look at people with any of the conditions Forrest mentions, they are all perfectly recognizable as belonging to either of the two sexes. It's not like it's ambiguous, and we can't tell if someone is a man or a woman based on their other features, psychology, mentality, hormone, and so forth. Given all these things are a one in several thousand scenario, you most likely only have one of the discussed mutations, not several. So you are a sex with a mutation. Actual exceptions are insanely rare, and those exceptions are and should be handled as exceptions. Because 1% of people don't perfectly conform, we shouldn't change the rules for the 99% that function perfectly fine or benefit from a binary system. Minority is not majority. No, chromosomes aren't the only thing that determines sex, but it also doesn't mean sex is on a spectrum. And his comparison with chemistry is critically flawed in the way that hydrogen and helium don't decide to become each other, and both of them are the building blocks of other atoms. In biology terms, they are stem cells that will build a bigger tissue. It's so far from the same thing as sex. A more accurate analogy would be that a coin has a 1 in 6,000 chance to land on its side during a coin flip. This is an even higher rate than most of the genetic mutations Forrest discussed. Does this mean a coin has more than two sides? No. It still has two sides, and when you flip a coin, you expect it to land on one of the two. These random comparisons don't say much, because the applicability of the rule relies heavily on the context of what's being discussed. Part 3 begins with the usual good old sex and gender split. This is a completely modern invention, and presenting it like this has always been the case is absurdly wrong. I showed in my first transgenderism video that those terms barely exist as separate things in any other language except English, and even their gender is only used for grammatical gender. The term gender role was coined by John Money and his fraudulent research. But okay, let's see how Forrest proves that these things are separate. Oh, he doesn't. What he does is give a false equivalence with Swyer syndrome.
If sex and gender were truly synonymous, then you would have to accept that this person is a man because they have XY chromosomes, which means some men can give birth. Or you'd have to accept that they are a woman because they have female reproductive anatomy, which means some women have XY chromosomes. Neither of which is possible within a strict binary essentialist framework.
Let's look at the examples of multiple genders. Hawaiian Mahu have spiritual and religious significance, but are still regular people. Mahu isn't a gender, it's a named role and has no application consistency. Hera represent only 0.2% of the population, and the title is once again only a descriptor for intersex people. Kwariwarmi are once again a religious function meant to bridge the gap between men and women, and this is so rare that in a worldwide census, they couldn't find a single person who identified as that term. I am actually familiar with Feminielli firsthand, so I can say it's basically the same as the term soy boy in meme culture. It's really just a name for a feminine man, and they decided to give it a superstitious good luck story. Culturally, it's used as a direct synonym for a gay man. The word is funny in Italian language context, and that's why people use it. The same story for Socrates. They are simply effeminate men with a name, they have religious purpose, and are very rare individuals. Same for Australian brother boys and sister girls. It's very clear that all these things are local societies noticing trans people as weird and unusual and assigning them religious or cultural significance. Mahu wouldn't be revered if half the tribe identified as that. Naples is a very tightly built city of about 1 million people, and it's not like you go walk the streets and see femminili everywhere. It's still so rare to see one that there's superstition attached to it. Many people in Naples will never see one in their lives. It's not normal. It's unusual. All of those cultures simply invented a name for people with gender dysphoria because they didn't know what was actually going on. It's similar to the various labels for demonic possession that schizophrenics got in the past. In fact, most psychiatric conditions fit these same criteria across history. Many names in many cultures for people with various mental conditions. Shamans connected schizophrenic visions with divine advice. It's all very similar to everything regarding gender dysphoric people around the world. Once again, I ask the question, why is gender dysphoria so special out of all of those? The core problem with all of this is that this whole section is meant to prove that trans people have always existed. They have. That's not the argument of anti-trans people. The argument is that gender dysphoria is a mental illness. All of the cultures Forrest brings up realize that people who claim to be a different gender are weird and strange, so they assign them religious value or create a special word for them. But it does not mean that such people would be numerous. It does not mean they are normal or anything else. It doesn't mean anyone can identify as whatever they want. Nobody is gender fluid. None of this even remotely follows this modern gender ideology. Pedophiles have always existed. In some societies, they even have leading roles, and they are represented in triple the most generous estimate of intersex people. Should we then accept such individuals as a natural variation of sexuality, or do we call it for what it is? It's fascinating how if you apply the arguments of pro-trans people to literally anything else, it completely falls apart, but for some reason gender dysphoria is a special case. What is so special about it? Also, Forrest brings up the women were hunters too in the past. I believe this paper is the one in his sources that addresses that. And the main problem here is that this paper only asks if women participated at all, not if they participated in equal amounts to men. And this is important because we have women hunters today as well. We have a couple women in male-dominated fields too, but they are absolutely not the majority, and not all women do this. The paper forgot to ask the crucial question of how many women participated in hunting. Probably not too many, because considering even this generous question, over 20% of society, in fact, had no women at all participating in hunting. Could it be that only a few women participated, just like today? Could it be that those few participated out of necessity and not choice? His other source is by John Speth, which first of all is not reviewed, but second and more importantly, all of the admittedly numerous examples of female quote-unquote hunters are actually not about hunting and more collaboration, and tasks split between men and women. Husbands and wives are a team, they always have been. I don't think anyone thinks so black and white that they imagine women did absolutely nothing else than forage for berries. They worked together and split labor. For example, men killed the animal, women packed the meat. Women carried things. Men protected and hunted. A lot of the examples show it was clearly a necessity to sometimes help, and basically, most of these examples do not actually show that women performed men's tasks equally or out of choice. You can read through all of those examples, and all of them follow pretty traditional gender roles we still have today. If anything, this is great proof that roles haven't really changed much in all those years. This is still how my grandparents lived. Accepting hunting was replaced by a farm. This same gender split held up for all these years. So this is terribly weak evidence. I have to reiterate this, because Forrest seems to really like this argument. I don't care what lizards do. I am not a lizard, and you cannot apply features of one species to another. You're a biologist. You should know this. It's even crazier, I have to argue this, because I fundamentally agree with him that homosexuality is significantly more acceptable than gender ideology, but for totally different reasons that have nothing to do with how a lizard is gay. If you want something relevant to humans, Toxoplasma gondii is a bacteria that is associated with sexual promiscuity and possibly homosexuality. This parasite does also affect humans and maybe is an answer in some cases. Of course, it's very far from causality or a proven link, but that's, for example, still more relevant than assuming humans are gender fluid because a lizard somewhere can change its gender. That kind of argument is frankly ridiculous to come from a biologist. A lizard does not need a doctor to cut off his genitals to become the opposite gender. This is such an awful false comparison. Next, Forrest touches on ROGD, which I have gone over in my response video to Jasper. There is no non-biased research that confirms or disproves ROGD, nor determines its prevalence. However, examples absolutely do exist, and I have gone over those in my previous video, but the trans community has plenty of examples of trans people themselves admitting they were victims of ROGD. The fact of the matter is that this simply does not have good research yet, and given that gender ideology only really became a wide social debate in the late 2010s, we are only going to see the real social contagion effects in the upcoming years, so we simply have to wait. But there are very many people already who realize that they would have been wronged by the ideology.
Which is one of the major reasons that all of these professional organizations, which collectively represent millions of licensed medical and mental health care professionals, have made public statements denouncing conversion therapy as the dangerous, pseudoscientific nonsense that it is.
Conversion therapy means barbaric methods. It doesn't mean humane therapies such as trauma therapy, therapies for phobias, for anxiety, or anything else. It also does not rule out any potential new therapies for gender dysphoria. Do not lump everything into one category. As far as sexual self-identification goes, I personally think it should be nobody's business what you do behind closed doors. But either way, gender dysphoria is a mental illness, or possibly a coping mechanism that evolved to cope with congruent mental health issues, and we shouldn't define social norms by someone who might just be sick. While he is correct in the way that humans are the only animals who can communicate in great detail about their experiences, we are also the only animals that can recognize mental issues and cure them. Both are valid routes, not just one. Technically, as Forrest himself points out, we don't know where homosexuality comes from either. It could also be a mental thing. I myself have observed at least 2 people develop homosexuality due to trauma. But that question is far less relevant and incomparably less important, because being gay doesn't require serious, irreversible surgical intervention to children and risk of infertility.
We need to be focused on science and be listening to the people who are living the lives that we want to understand.
The same argument as Jasper. Listen to trans people. But only the correct ones, not any of these. Not Blair White, not Scott Nugent. Exactly a specific kind of trans person. Stop using this argument. I unfortunately cannot comment much on the neuroscience part, because that is really far from my expertise, but at least from my limited knowledge. I know that human brains are incredibly dense and efficient. Brain size is absolutely not what matters. So if we are talking about the size differences of the nucleus of anterior hypothalamus in rat sexes versus human sexes, the reduction of size difference doesn't necessarily mean less difference, just a denser and more efficient brain region. Same reason why whales aren't 5 times smarter than humans, despite having a 5 times larger brain. I also have a problem with him bringing up the idea that individual experiences shape the brain and gender identity, when just a few minutes ago, He was labeling social influence on gender as dangerous pseudoscience that was disproved by John Money. So does social influence on gender exist or not? You can't use it when it suits you and call it pseudoscience when it doesn't. It can't only go one way. I simply do not have the necessary background knowledge to really address the brain differences studies. I'm not so familiar with what part of the brain controls what and what those differences mean. So I hope some neuroscientist can help interpret this data on my behalf. But at least as a scientific observation and thought about this part, I think my main questions that I would like clarifications on with this data is how these differences change over time. For example, in detransitioners, are these permanent changes? Also, how do we know we aren't just finding clues on how to treat dysphoria without surgery? Brains of patients with other psychiatric conditions are also markedly different from the general population. So wouldn't this just simply give us insight into alternative treatments? I'm sure you can measure the brain differences that lead someone to be schizophrenic or anorexic. And of course, all these things are natural occurrences. But I think there's a clash here between Forrest's biological background and psychological literature. But again, my background in neurobiology is insufficient to fully understand these papers, so I will move on from this point. I will say again, though, that I don't understand why life experiences suddenly matter, while trans social contagion is supposedly a myth. I just cannot wrap my head around this argument, but trans activists apparently think this is some big gotcha argument. I don't see it. It's just selective application of an idea when it suits you. How can gender be a social construct, yet it's impossible to socially construct a gender for you? Trans activists need to pick a side here. This is logically incoherent.
It's important that we take care not to pathologize LGBT identities. Not only is it abundantly clear that these are not diseases or disorders.
I'm sorry. No, it's not abundantly clear. You have not proven that these aren't anomalies.
It is at least equally possible that you fall somewhere along this fuzzy gradient, and that shouldn't bother you.
It's also not equally possible that you fall in between, as we have established earlier in this video. It's actually very rare.
Evidence-based gender-affirming care protects transgender people from a greater incidence of anxiety, depression, and self-harm. Despite the fact that we have standards of care and clinical guidelines which are widely accepted for transgender adults and children alike, which recommend a staged process of transition which allows these individuals to explore their gender identities while keeping their options open. And despite the fact that the regret rate for these interventions is significantly lower than many common treatments and surgeries that nobody takes issue with.
You can check out a more detailed look into regret rates in my response to Jasper.
And what's worse, LGBT youth who report coming from non-accepting or non-supportive families are 8 times as likely to have attempted suicide than other LGBT youth. We're spreading the harmful message that their thoughts, feelings, and identities are something to be ashamed of and hidden away, as well as fueling the exact same kind of bullying and stigmatization that leads to serious harm in any children. And because of our cultural attitudes surrounding gender, the risks for women, girls, and those with diverse gender identities continue well into the outside world and throughout their entire lives.
I will just speak on one point around this nonsense, which is that yes, trans people experience higher rates of sexual violence and abuse, but is that before or after transitioning? Because if you want to eliminate the possibility that gender dysphoria can develop from trauma, that's an important distinction.
As we see, for example, in men and boys, who are more likely to take unnecessary risks with their mental, physical, and sexual health, abuse drugs and alcohol, smoke tobacco, and even refuse mental and physical health care, all in the interest of appearing tough and manly.
Boys engage in risky behavior because of the gender difference that boys are less agreeable than girls and more open to experience. Boys are natural risk takers. This is another point where complementing your knowledge with psychology would have better explained your idea than gender ideology.
But if the biggest problem you're having in the 21st century is what people's genitals look like and what they're doing with their genitals in the company of other consenting adults, if that is the needle on your moral compass, I strongly encourage you to reevaluate your priorities.
I'm sorry you are actually the one who shoves this ideology down other people's throats. It's important to you. I didn't care about this until you brought it up. You and Jasper are the ones who made hours-long videos on the topic that we need to debunk. This isn't my idea, don't push it on me. I don't want to have to care about this. Also, as a researcher, when I publish, it's true, every time I have to go through this questionnaire on inclusivity. But they don't actually provide any sources for this. The web page that's supposed to contain sources doesn't contain any sources, because there aren't any. Elsevier, the biggest science publisher, is not sure enough in any study on gender ideology to use it to explain why they are doing this questionnaire. You need to be more careful with what you call a fact, Forrest. In the end, I have to say Forrest did a better scientific job. His sources are much better than Jasper's. I guess this isn't surprising considering Forrest had a review team and is himself in academia. However, a large chunk of these studies are completely irrelevant to humans. There is a lot of very cool and useful information in this resource list. I definitely learned a lot of new things. But as seen also from Forrest's points, they don't mean much in the context of this conversation. Forrest's main point that I can identify in his video seems to be that, because nature has so many different ways of handling these concepts, sex and gender are unfairly simplified. However, this argument falls flat completely because male seahorses getting pregnant doesn't mean human males can get pregnant in any natural way without hundreds of thousands of dollars of insanely complex and thorough surgical intervention. And even then, it won't work as smoothly as for natural women. You just can't apply the logic of other animals to humans. His second point is that all the diverse mutations and anomalies in our chromosomes, gonadal sex, reproductive organs, and so forth, we cannot speak of a binary. And this point also falls flat because intersex features are not a characteristic of every person. They are rare mutations, and also changes from gender norms don't put sexuality on a spectrum. There are thousands of things that separate men from women, and if I made a video or reference list on that, it would be a 10-hour video. Even if you strip humans down to nothing but their bones, archaeologists are still able to figure out if a skeleton was male or female. There are differences in every part of our bodies, every part of our psychology, in every aspect of our lives, and everything else. When we are talking about these anomalies from gender norms, we are usually talking about 1 or 2 deviations at most. You're a girl who's into computer science. You're a man who wants to be a kindergarten teacher. You're a girl that strives in a competitive corporate environment, or you're a man who loves sex and the city. You're maybe a girl with a chromosome mutation or a man with ambiguous genitals. All those kind of things mean you are likely a man or a woman in 99.99%, but you have some trait or a few traits closer to the opposite gender. It doesn't make you the opposite gender. Oh no, my chromosomes are wrong, I guess I'm a man now. Even though I'm clearly still a woman in 99% of everything else. Given how rare these mutations are, the odds of someone even having 2 such mutations are absurdly low. I can completely agree that we should allow each gender to participate in whatever they want. If a girl wants to study mechanical engineering, and she competes with men on entrance exams, of course she should be allowed to do that. But those things aren't the rule. In egalitarian countries, like Scandinavian countries, the more they eradicate social expectations, the more women choose fields according to their biological programming. This isn't an accident. My university has tons of scholarships for women in STEM and none for men. And this is true also in broader academic context. There's no such thing as scholarships for men. There are support groups for women. I've lost jobs to women less qualified than me or due to gender quotas. They are welcomed with open arms, and they still don't choose those fields. Because gender differences are biological and ineradicable without intense tyranny that would push people into things they don't want. Expecting a 50-50 representation in everything is absolutely insane, and it's not how gender works. It's clearly false. And for the people who simply feel like the opposite gender, that's gender dysphoria, and considering it's mechanistically so similar to other issues, which I've talked about in this video. It's very possible we can find a cure for it without having to chemically castrate children and without barbaric approaches. And really quickly, appealing to authority is a bit moot, considering the quote-unquote authorities also post things like this and a few decades ago were promoting smoking. You should still look at the arguments themselves. Institutions can actually be politically charged. Look, generally yes, if we apply human logic of sex to the broader animal kingdom, it falls apart. I totally agree. But for the context of human society, our old definitions of sex apply. And I totally agree that sometimes we are too strict with gender norms, but generally, these things work, and changing the norms will work for the 1% of trans people, while being totally confusing, unnecessary, and impractical for 99% of people. And it would be especially pointless, considering that 1% might just simply have a treatable mental condition in the first place. Apply this gender concept to pedophilia as a natural variation of sexuality, and tell me it's a good argument for accepting it. What we are doing is pathologically wrong and scientifically dishonest. And even if I take in all of Forrest's arguments as true, gender dysphoria affects 0.01% of people at the high end of prevalence. 0.01% is enough to warrant changing rules for all of society. But at the same time, if we assume Jasper's arguments to be true, detransitioners would be 0.3% of trans people. So a 30 times bigger portion is negligible, but the 0.01% is not. So not even by trans activist logic, this makes any sense. For the record, detransitioners are actually far more than 0.3%. Puberty blockers are initiated on about 200 people per year in America, and about 500 per year receive hormones. And yet, detrans groups have several thousands of members. The desistance is clearly significantly higher than reported, but those aren't the correct trans people, right? That's all negligible. But the 1 in 10,000 people who simply feel they don't fit into the binary framework, those are statistically relevant and we must cater to them. I don't buy this argument. Again, English is the only language that can even reasonably speak of a divide between sex and gender. Every other language had to borrow the word gender to talk about Western stupidity, or their word for gender only relates to grammar. This isn't something normal. Most societies with thousands of years of history and millions of people have not had enough of these things to even develop words for it. And those that did assign them as religious roles or slurs. Forrest's video makes it seem like there is so much of this, but realistically most people won't even meet one person like this in their life. It's that rare. And most of it could be treatable or doesn't even really mean anyone is a different gender than what they were assigned at birth. Let's stop acting like having a mental illness is something to be ashamed of. Let's stop assuming that treating a mental issue is abuse or dehumanizing, and let's help trans people find comfort in their own body without any associated risks, and without making life unnecessarily complicated for the billions of people who function perfectly fine in the binary framework. Even trans people follow a binary framework. Trans people aren't trying to be a random spot on a gender spectrum, they specifically want to be the opposite gender. Anyway, thanks for watching. Feel free to discuss ideas in comments. Trans activists can feel free to dislike this video without watching it and assuming it's AI generated, and everyone else share this video around to people who you think need to see it. See you in the next video.